Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we talk about one of the most talked about battles in European history, the 732 Battle of Tours. Variously called one of the most important battles in European history, or a minor skirmish, the battle had a large impact on the minds of medieval Europeans. But what might have happened if it had gone different? And without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
The period between the 14th and 16th century AD, when the Ottoman Empire rose, overthrew the last vestiges of the Roman Empire by conquering Constantinople, and then threatened all of Europe, coming to the very gates of Vienna, is well studied and largely well remembered. But people sometimes forget that the rise of the Ottoman Empire was not the first time that a Muslim invasion threatened all of Europe. Because 600 years before, in the 8th century AD, the Moorish invasion through Iberia looked like the Muslim empires might overrun all of Europe, an event that, had it occurred, would have dramatically changed world history. But it was not to be. The Moorish invasion through Iberia was eventually stymied and then pushed back in a more than 700-year conflict called the Reconquista, and the turning point was a battle that has received surprisingly little attention. The 732 AD Battle of Tours is one of the most important in European history, and it deserves to be remembered. In the 7th century, the Prophet Muhammad conquered and unified much of Arabia under Muslim rule. After Muhammad's death in 632, Abu Bakr became the first caliph, meaning successor, and formed the first caliphate, which expanded to include much of North Africa and the former Persian Empire. In 661, that caliphate was succeeded by the Umayyad Caliphate, which continued to expand the empire, both east and west. At the beginning of the 8th century AD, the Iberian Peninsula, encompassing the modern-day countries of Spain and Portugal, was a Visigothic kingdom. The Visigoths were Christian descendants of the Western Roman Empire, but in 710, the king of the Visigoths, Witza, died, some accounts claim by assassination. Divided, the kingdom was easy prey. Crossing the Gibraltar Strait in 711, the Umayyad army routed and nearly annihilated the Visigoth army, and then in just 2 years conquered all of Iberia except for a small mountainous region in the north. In 720, the Umayyads crossed the Pyrenees Mountains to attack the last province of the Visigoths, Septimania, in what is today southeastern France. The invaders were largely Berbers, North Africans who were themselves recently converted to Islam, and frequently referred to in Europe as Moors, derived from the Roman name for the Berber people of the Roman African province. The invasion of Septimania put the Moors on the borders of the mighty Kingdom of Francia, but, like the Visigoths, the Franks were in the midst of a civil war. The Franks were a collection of Germanic peoples who had formed an empire in Western Europe that eventually led to the birth of the modern nations of France and Germany. While sometimes at odds with them, the Franks were usually allies of the Romans, and ended up inheriting most of the Western Roman Empire. The Kingdom of Francia had been unified in 496, but the kings had become corrupt during a period that was called Roi Fainéant, which literally means do-nothing kings. The kings themselves became figureheads, and power had fallen to an official called the Mayor of the Palace, who controlled both the kingdom's army and its finances. But in 714, the Mayor of the Palace died, and Francia fell into civil war over choosing a successor. By 718, a successor, Charles Martel, had won the civil war and the title Mayor of the Palace. But many of the kingdom's outlying duchies had gained de facto independence during the period of the Civil War, and he was struggling to bring them back in line. Among those was the large and powerful Duchy of Aquitaine, who, under its leader, Duke Odo, opposed Charles. It was Aquitaine that was next in the Umayyads' sights. But because of division within Francia, when Odo asked for Charles Martel's help, Martel refused. Still, Odo was able to win a significant victory against the Umayyads in the 721 Battle of Toulouse, where Odo was able to surprise a Moorish army that had insufficiently prepared for a counterattack while they were besieging the city of Toulouse. But it was only a brief respite, as conflict among the Franks would offer the Umayyads another opportunity. In 732, while Odo was distracted fighting Charles Martel to the north, the Umayyads invaded again and overran most of Aquitaine. Odo rushed all the troops he could south, but the Umayyads did not make the same mistakes that they made at Toulouse, and Odo's army was routed at the Battle of the River Garonne. Now, the Moors controlled all of southern France and were threatening the very heart of the Frankish Empire, and Charles Martel's army was the only thing that was preventing a Moorish conquest of all of Western Europe. Having defeated both the Visigoths and Aquitaine, the Muslim commander, Abdul al-Rahman, the governor of Umayyad-ruled Iberia, had every reason to be confident. The focus of the battle became the city of Tours, the site of the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours. The abbey was one of the most important Christian sites in Western Europe, and Abdul al-Rahman knew that it would have significant riches to loot. Charles, whose military career was marked by surprising his enemy by moving his army where it was not expected, quickly moved his forces in front of Tours. The Umayyads, unaware of the military power of the Franks, were caught off guard when they ran into Martel's forces, blocking them from their goal. Martel's move was effective. Abdul al-Rahman knew that he could not ask his army to leave without sacking and getting the riches of the city of Tours, and running away from a Christian army would have been devastating to morale. And so Abdul al-Rahman was compelled to fight Charles Martel's army on ground of Charles Martel's choosing. Martel, whose army was mostly infantry, chose a gentle slope with his flanks protected by heavy woods. While both armies sat for a week, gathering their forces, eventually Abdul al-Rahman had no choice but to attack. The Umayyads were a modern and veteran force. They had much more cavalry than the Franks, and their bows outranged the Frankish bows. But their battle strategy depended upon maneuver and envelopment, and with his flanks protected, they had to attack Martel's army head-on. They spent a day throwing attacks up the hill, but the Frankish shields in formation stood, and Frankish discipline held, keeping them from breaking formation. Exhausted from battering against the Frankish wall, the Umayyads finally broke. When the Franks pursued, Abdul al-Rahman was caught trying to lead a rear guard, and killed. Charles Martel elected not to pursue the fleeing Moors, fearing that there would be ambushes, but Odo and the Aquitanians did, and much of the Moorish army was destroyed. The Franks saw the victory as legendary, and Charles Martel won the moniker the Hammer because of the victory. But the Umayyads saw the Battle of Tours being of little importance, and because they said Abdul al-Rahman was really only leading a raiding party and not truly an invasion army. Modern-day historians are split on the subject. Most still argue that had Martel lost the Battle of Tours, that the Umayyads would have overrun all of Western Europe. But some note that Abdul al-Rahman's only goal at the time seemed to be to loot the shrine at Tours. Still others argue that it was Odo's victory at Toulouse that was most important, because that's the victory that gave Charles Martel time to consolidate his control of Francia and build his army. But in any case, the Battle of Tours had little overall impact on the strength of Moorish forces in Iberia. Still, it had two important impacts. First, it re-established Frankish rule over Aquitaine, greatly increasing the strength of the empire. And second, it killed Abdul al-Rahman, who was the governor of Umayyad Iberia. It took nearly 2 years for the Umayyads to choose a successor, and in that time Charles Martel was able to strengthen his hand and grow his empire, an empire that would continue to grow under his successors, including, of course, his famous grandson, Charlemagne. While the Moors would attempt a few more raids north, the fact is that the Moors were on the defensive after the Battle of Tours, which represented the high watermark of the Moorish invasion of Iberia. After Tours, the Reconquista had begun. It was a conflict that would go for another 760 years before the last Moorish kingdom in Iberia, the Kingdom of Granada, finally capitulated in 1492.
Now for the fun part, where I, the history guy himself, and longtime friend of the history guy Brad Wagnon, discuss what might have happened if everything had gone differently. So today we're talking about the Battle of Tours, which is an incredibly interesting battle. And I think one of the interesting things is how opinion among historians has changed in terms of how important this battle was. But I think this is something that we'll get to talk about a lot here, is how important the battle was, kind of regardless of whether it was as important as some of the historians have said. I think there were some significant things that happened that could have changed history.
Absolutely. We might have been the first people in any podcast anywhere to ask how would history have changed if we hadn't domesticated cats. But in terms of the Battle of Tours, where this is well stomped ground, and you can find all over YouTube and all over podcast world people talking about the battle. Hopefully, we'll offer some new insights, and I'm sure they haven't thrown Bigfoot into the equation or whatever we'll probably do by the end of this thing. But yeah, it's interesting, and you do see very differing viewpoints about it, and that is interesting. And we'll also look this puts. I think I heard another person on a YouTube channel say something about this has enough butterflies flapping their wings. So when you start looking out on the longer term, there's some really interesting potential impacts here.
And yeah, I do agree. I mean, there are historians who go anywhere from saying that this is the most famous and most significant battle since leading up to Waterloo, or the Battle at the Gates of Moscow. And then there are other people who are saying it was a raid.
Yeah. I mean, it's really in between. This was the end of Christendom if they lost. Mm-hmm. To this would have been them raiding the cathedral at Tours, and that's an interesting. It's even an interesting place to start. Is which of those two that you think that it is, because there's kind of arguments on both sides. Even if this was a raiding party, if for example Charles Martel had been killed, then France would have been open for any other kind of invasion. As a matter of fact, this victory allowed him to consolidate his wins and create the Carolingian Empire. So even if you say this was just a raiding party and this was not Abdul al-Rahman trying to take all of France, it could have put him in a position where he could have done that. And so even that sort of it's just a raiding party thing could have long-term implications. But I mean, on the other hand, and on the other side of the world, the Umayyad Caliphate was not long for this world. And so even if it had been some big victory, would the caliphate have collapsed? Would they have been able to maintain any gains that they got? So it could have been even bigger or smaller than what others are talking about. It might have been. I mean, if the Umayyads, if they win, but then they overextend the Umayyads, and the Umayyads collapse more completely, because actually the Umayyads kind of survive out there in Andalusia. But if they win and they overextend the Umayyads and the Umayyads collapse, then maybe it has even less impact in terms of Islam affecting Europe. So it's a really because it's coming at an interesting time, and so it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know. I can see kind of both ends of it. I think if we talk about it in terms of counterfactual, you could see it both ways in terms of was it a huge victory, was it a tiny victory? Still, what does that mean for history? But I don't know. What's your opinion? Was this big? Was it small? Was it in the middle?
In my opinion, it was somewhere in the middle, because every empire starts with successful raiding. It seems, if this raid was successful, then that would just basically indicate that the welcome mat had been left out in southern France, and the Amids should certainly return for more goodies. So
and they would. They certainly showed that they would. But I mean, the other question is if Martel does not unify the Franks, who were very fractured at the time, who else stands against the Umayyads then? If they can overrun France, where does it end? I mean, the Umayyads twice failed to take Constantinople, but what if they were attacking from both sides?
Yeah. Yeah, and
they take all of Europe and are tumbling down through Europe, then they might have a better chance there if they're on both sides of the Bosporus.
Yeah, I do like the point. The Umayyad Empire, much like one of our previous discussions involving Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is facing an empire that, even though it seems overwhelmingly powerful, is not long for this world, and the Umayyads are much the same way. They only have another 10 to 15 years.
Within 20 years, they were defeated by the Abbasids. But the Abbasids don't defeat El Andalusia. They don't take Spain, and that's an interesting question too. Even if going that direction. Let's say that Martel loses Tours, and the Umayyads are able to take there in France quite a bit more. Then the remnants of the Umayyads, which was what Spain was, and the Caliph actually escaped there. Then they would have been a much larger counter to the Abbasids. And so, what does it mean in terms of Islamic heritage? Because we can talk in terms of, does it turn all of Europe Arab or all of Europe Muslim? Does it kill Christianity, etc.? But what happens if the remnants of the Umayyads are something closer to a parity with the Abbasids? And do they? I mean, the caliphates were prone to civil strife, and so could this have led to like a massive conflict between the Umayyads and the Abbasids? I mean, that's one potential if there was a victory there that made the Umayyad Caliphate in Europe a more powerful caliphate.
Yeah. Now that leads into in doing this research. And by the way, it's fun to do research on this period because it is not cut and dried hundreds of thousands of academic volumes. This is really a period of early medieval history where the documentation is not necessarily complete. One of the interesting developments that occurs that really kind of seals off Spain is the Mahdite rebellion. Apparently the Berbers in Morocco buying into a lot of the Abbasid arguments that the Arabs are treating themselves as elites versus non-Arabs. They basically rebel, and they more or less form an independent entity that stands between, southern Spain and the bulk of what is going to be the last of the Umayyad, and then eventually the Abbasid empire.
Yeah. So the Abbasids don't so much take over the Umayyad Caliphate as they fracture it. And then they keep a bit there, and so that's true. And would a victory here have changed any of that dynamic? Yeah. It's kind of hard to say. But you mentioned that this is, it's not well records kept. Actually, that's an interesting part of it when we talk even about, how this impacts Christianity versus Islam too, is that this was the Dark Ages for Europe and Christianity, and this was the Golden Age for Islam and the Umayyads in terms of science and art and religion and things like that, or science, art development, and so it's hard to say. I mean, maybe we lose the Italian Renaissance, or maybe we lose the Enlightenment, but we have an Islamic Enlightenment earlier too. And what happens if that Islamic Enlightenment is taking over, France and northern Italy and everything the Carolinians took over? So it's not. You're right. Nothing's cut and dry. It's hard to say, because even if the question here is Christianity teetering on the brink of being eliminated by the Islamic caliphates? Exactly what that means for the people of Europe is a really interesting question, because it's kind of not clear at this point. At this point, Islamic thinking is much broader. They're actually saving the works of the Greeks that eventually are going to drive much of thought in the Christian world, and the Christians had lost those.
Yeah, and the Battle of Tours obviously does not take place in a vacuum. At this point, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, is still alive and kicking. To the point where it is besieged several times, and each time it essentially sends the host that are the would-be invaders packing. So there's certainly enough strength left that particular door into Europe through the Balkans is pretty well shut. So
it is, but I mean, let's say the Umayyads take another, take France. Then does that change that equation so that then they are able to finally take Constantinople? I mean, I don't know how what's going on in France totally shifts that, because it really wasn't kind of naval war that kept them from being able to totally, win in a siege of. But I mean, if this, it seems that. France, being France, has enough in terms of resources. The Franks and the Carolinians became important, that if those resources had shifted to the Umayyads, then that might have changed their capacity, because, they very nearly came twice to capturing Constantinople. So does victory at Tours make it more likely that they find victory against the Byzantines? And if they collapse the Eastern Roman Empire, what's left of the Western Roman Empire, right? Can they defend themselves without the Eastern Roman Empire? So, again, Christianity could literally be on the line. And also the Carolinians end up taking northern Italy, right? So, without the Carolinian Empire, You've got those, the Lombards and those guys in northern Italy also to contest with Rome. And so there could be another challenge simply by removing the Carolinians from the equation.
It's I think that, I mean, in terms of the way that they talk about it, especially like Gibbon and stuff like that, when they want to say that without this battle, all of Europe would have been taken over by the Muslims. I mean, I think that that's probably not quite as simple as that, but it is a good question. If they can, if they do destabilize the Frankish kingdom, what is there besides that in Europe that's going to be able to stand against them? And there's not a lot. That was
whatever it is probably fractured and not all that important to history. But honestly, the Umayyads never really stopped getting in trouble with what was left of the Visigoths there in Spain. So I mean, it's not like the conquest was ever like complete. And so even if they do, I mean, does Europe uprise? Does Christianity remain and keep fighting back? And I mean, it's you're stretching it to the end to say that they can literally come and convert the whole population, and by whatever dynamic it ends up, they're able to beat the Byzantines, and then Rome standing alone finally collapses. It's kind of hard to see all of Europe falling to Islam without really pushing beyond their supply chain.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was a reason, and one of the reasons they end up stopping at in Spain is that even after this defeat, there's so much left to coordinate within Spain still, and so they still are fighting there. And then, of course, after the fall of the Umayyads, they were cut off from the whole caliphate, and what was left in Spain just didn't have the strength to try to go conquer France. But it is, of course, they also at that point faced a pretty united Frankish kingdom, which might have been very different if the Umayyads had won at Tours. Even, honestly, if Martel hadn't died at Tours, but simply had not won, that could have affected his ability to...
There's a very good chance, that he never consolidates his power because he's in the middle of a civil war at the time.
Yeah,
and that's, I mean, and if Charles Martel does not unify the Franks, then you don't get Charlemagne.
Yeah, and that impacts the Holy Roman Empire. And
when we talk about how far could it have gone, I mean, is there a realistic idea to talk about Islam in England?
I don't think so. In fact, I think that we have some evidence. The fact that Odo actually marries his daughter to Manusa of Livia. Is and that's more or less as an alliance with Aquitaine.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was, I think, the beginning of that was the beginning of an indication that this area, which I believe was primarily populated by Berbers, who again 10 years later will rise up in North Africa as well, that they were not necessarily as happy with the mainstay of the Spanish. Of the Umayyads in Spain.
I mean, if Martel loses at Tours, I think there's a good chance that Odo is killed because Aquitaine remains in their hands. So, I mean, I think a loss at Tours could mean the end of Odo, which means the end of that particular alignment. But
Aquitaine was in trouble.
At the same time, Aquitaine was definitely in trouble. And it's also interesting, Odo only survives an additional 3 years.
I mean, that's kind of the minimum. If they had lost at Tours, then Aquitaine probably stays with the Umayyads for much longer.
Yeah, I think I think that we can all agree on that.
There were some further attacks after Tours, and parts of, I mean, they raided into parts of southern France. There were 2 campaigns then that Charles fights to essentially kick the remaining ones, except for in Septimania and at Narbonne, where he still has to fight them off after Tours. The Umayyads were certainly not like out of energy, and it was not so large an army at Tours that they lost their ability to project power into France.
Yeah, I mean, more important, because it was really a raiding party. More important was the death of Abu Rahman because not because he was so uniquely important, but because it took forever to decide who else came after. So I mean, Charles Martel might have been hard to, and then Pepin the Short, and then Charlemagne. That might have been a different. They might have been important enough as individual personalities that losing them from the scenario could dramatically affect the lives of people across vast swaths of Europe. But the death of the governor at the Battle of Tours really did put the brakes on the ability of the Umayyads to come and start pressing quickly, and that's what gave Charles Martel time to consolidate all of his power in France in the fight among the Franks, and that's really what allows the Reconquista to come. And so there's, even a minor victory there, even if they push him back, it puts the Umayyads in a much better position to say we're going to continue to attack while he's not able yet to consolidate.
Yeah, and there's still some question on how much they'd been able to do, because they had kind of stopped in Spain because they were busy having internal struggles, which eventually culminates in the Abbasid Empire. But
only how far can you go? Well, I think that last time that the Umayyads were besieging Constantinople, a big part of the reason that they lost was that the fleets that they sent up from Egypt had a lot of Christian sailors who then left and joined the Byzantines. And so even in Egypt, they were struggling with the fact that they had not been able to really consolidate all of their power. So this idea that they were going to build mosques everywhere and they just finally convert everybody, used to be able to do that in Total War III, right? You'd turn Rome 98% Muslim, but I don't think that was necessarily a realistic appraisal of what was going to go on.
It would have been pretty difficult.
Of course, then all of a sudden, a Christian army would pop up out of the ground. That was a very interesting game, wasn't it? Yeah. Don't know. It was quite accurate.
I did. One of the things I saw was I was doing research was that part of what I think some people miss is that this especially in southern France, it was not as Christian as we might assume. For one, the Franks were fairly recently converted to Christianity, and it took some time for that to spread to the populace, and out of just the top with Clovis, and so those regions were not necessarily as heavily Christianized as we might want to believe, and we might get the impression.
If you destroy the cathedral at Tours, that's a big part of their ability to slowly convert the population. Then you're right. Maybe the population is more convertible than they were. It also might mean if you reduce the Carolinians, it might mean that you have some of these pagan, the stuff that's going on in Germany and et cetera. Yeah. Some of that might exist much longer because some of the pagan worship across northern Europe was really it was the Carolinians that really kind of got rid of those groups.
Yeah, it was.
So it might mean more religious diversity.
I'm trying to remember the name of the exact guy, but one of the important things that Martel does is empower one of the main German Christian saints that goes and converts, and so that's an important piece, and if that even takes longer, that can significantly change the history of Europe. We get used to, and I can't help but think that some of the ways that this history has been read and kind of interpreted has to do with it still exists, this idea of this kind of Muslim versus Christian worldviews. Mm-hmm. And so it feels like, that if you're looking at it that way and looking at kind of how Christian society developed afterwards in Western Europe and ultimately kind of Western civilization, it's easy to look at Tours and say this was vitally important because the other option is the Muslim dominance.
Yeah, and that's not fair. Honestly, the Muslims were more tolerant of Christianity than the Christians were of Islam.
Yeah,
and so it's true. If Islam had gone, like you said, there were Christians in Egypt. So if Islam had taken over France, it wouldn't have meant the end of Christianity in France, but it would mean that the Christians are the ones building the cathedrals.
Well, and it significantly impacts culture. These are times where our ideas and visions of what medieval Europe looks like come directly from Christian influence. Absolutely. And adding Islamic influence would significantly impact kind of what that.
Look at the architectural difference between Spain and France, and it's very noticeable. And honestly, again, they were relative to what was going on in Christianity. The Umayyads were scientists. They were philosophers, and they were engaging in a lot. I mean, we might have discovered quite a lot sooner. Though one of the long-term questions is if this ends up maintaining the caliphate or having a huge impact on Christianity, 500 years later, is Europe finding the New World, and is Europe conquering the New World in the same way that they do today? I mean, that's or not today, but I mean that they did.
Yeah.
That's how much does that change the path of history if we never get Ferdinand and Isabella, if we never get Genoa, if we don't have a Christopher Columbus because Europe is so completely different, do the caliphates when they hit that point, and maybe even more quickly because they are much more scientifically oriented, are they showing up in the New World earlier, or is that not an interest?
It's an interesting question. It's hard to. They ultimately, of course, they end up being pressed more further east, and so they don't really have the opportunity to do that. But at this point, they were literally in Spain. Where all of this ends up. That's where the money came from, and I don't know what that looks like in terms of if it happens sooner or not. Like, at what point do we have ships that can cross and that are interested in crossing? And of course, one of the main reasons why they did that crossing was because they needed to get Christopher Columbus was trying to find ways to get to the Spice Islands, and the Muslim empires didn't necessarily have that problem because they were far enough east that they could get there.
They were far enough east,
the Silk Road.
Relations with China, it's interesting because if the caliphate lasts longer and is more powerful, does that keep the Silk Road open longer? And does that facilitate more interaction between Europe and China? Because it doesn't. You're right, because the caliphate is so broad. It doesn't just impact the West.
The same desires too, but on the other hand, they could have different motivations for still crossing that ocean.
This also brings up a really interesting question that will come to bear in approximately the year 800, and that is if the caliphate comes in and controls significant portions of what we consider France or the Frankish Empire, what happens when they discover those jolly Northmen who come sailing down?
Oh, true.
Yeah.
If the caliphate prevents the Norse settlement in Normandy, then that dramatically impacts the long-term history of England.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Rollo settling there in Normandy is vital ultimately to the England that we get.
Yeah.
That's how that transforms the history of Northern Europe. But it's true. That's an interesting question. And who knows if the caliphate would have been able to push him out? But would the caliphate have done what the Franks did, which was essentially settle them there? Mm-hmm. To try to maintain that peace, and even if they just don't do that, that alters.
Even if the caliphate never reaches England, it doesn't decide. Which, if we're talking about if they're going to cross the Atlantic, you'd think they'd probably cross the Channel at some point.
Yeah.
But even if the caliphate leaves England alone by impacting the direction of the Norse, then that's going to have a dramatic impact on the overall history of England.
Yeah, I do think that. In the long run, I'm not sure that the caliphate could actually hold France because there's just too much going on in that area. There's definitely a history of independence and nonconformism, if you will. And there's a lot of additional conquering that actually the Franks have to do before we even get to the Carolingian Empire, and by extension, the whole Roman Empire.
But which then, of course, goes back to where what that means in terms of conquest and stuff like that in the New World. But if you defeat Charles Martel, if you keep him from going, then you empower those other groups that they're fighting against. So it might mean an increased power on the other side of France too, because those are the ones that his unification also. So if the Franks had to go and conquer those people, if there's not as powerful Frank force, then those people are relatively empowered. What does that mean? And
it's harder to tell.
Yeah,
because you might be surprised by sometimes all it takes is a particularly talented warlord, and that might turn the Lombards into having a huge empire, as opposed to, essentially what happens, which is that they're fairly regional. But if they have that opportunity, that certainly, someone steps into that power vacuum, and whether that means someone comes in and sucks up all the power and becomes like the power for the next century, or you spend a century with various people trying to do that,
fractures in small kingdoms.
Yeah, and either one of those is possible.
Well, and how different is the 20th century if all you do is change borders? Because at this time there's still not a concept of France, right? And so what if Spain is includes all of southern France? Even if things end up settling, and even if there's still a Reconquista, what if we have a different idea of what is France, what is Spain, what is Italy, what is Germany? Then obviously that dramatically impacts that. Into the
I think you can make a good argument
into the modern era
that without France developing the way that it does, it is possible at least that the Byzantine Empire ultimately reunites with the Western Roman Empire.
That's fair. Because the fact that there was
if you don't have the Carolinians taking out the Lombards, then the Lombards are threatening Rome. Then Rome is in a much less position to cause the schism between them and the East, right? So maybe this would create a pressure that would keep the Eastern and Western Roman Empire
at least
together.
What's left of the Western Roman Empire at that point. But there was still significant stuff, and the Byzantines had control throughout, at different times throughout the Mediterranean. They were just never really able to.
The Byzantines do try to make a go of it. With reuniting, and they do conquer a fair amount of the boot of Italy, as well as some of the island areas. And so, a reinvigorated, unified or reunified Roman Empire is definitely a possibility.
A second Rome.
That would be interesting if you don't have the
you're right.
The power of the Franks to kind of balance those two sides, because ultimately, for a long time, how Rome and the Papal States live is by continually balancing the powers of the Byzantines and whatever powers are in the East with the fact that there is a power in the West, and if there isn't something quite on the like France, like the Franks, then maybe that does mean that they just simply they don't have the leverage that they want, and that could impact how the papacy and papal primacy, the primacy of the Roman See and stuff like that. That could all be altered, which would have an enormous impact in terms of how. Gosh.
And when Christendom is unified, they definitely turned out to be a powerful force. So what if this causes more of a unification of Christianity, and then it maybe becomes more clearly a conflict between Islam and Christianity? Because really, as much as you want to say that, there was much more conflict inside both of those groups than between them.
Well, and that's there is some talk about how the Battle of Tours ends up kind of defining that conflict, as that it was an important piece of how eventually Christian Europe would kind of envision the two powers against one another, and that helped inspire the Crusades. That was the
Oh, absolutely, it did. Yeah,
and that's significant.
Oh, very much. Yeah. Charlemagne was very much an inspiration. Yeah. It's funny to think, but if you get a much greater influence of Islam across Europe, do we ever get a culture that keeps pet dogs?
That's an interesting question. Even if it's
just
question. Not that everyone converts, but there's just that kind of cultural idea.
A significant cultural influence. Do we then develop the culture that we have where people keep dogs as pets? And we make all these breeds of, and we're this is very early on, right? Still, we've been breeding dogs for a long time at that point. But in terms of the modern dog breeds, none of them look like that in 930. Do we have the breeds of dogs that we have? We maybe never get the Pekingese because we never get the culture of keeping dogs as pets that we would eventually develop. That would cause us to breed all these different dog breeds. It's a crazy thing to talk about, but it would dramatically change life if there was a fairly large cultural feeling about keeping dogs as pets. Bacon too. Maybe we lose bacon.
I was just going to say that is the true tragedy. The one thing in the Western world that we certainly cannot imagine living without is bacon.
Gosh,
And if you have a much stronger Muslim
that would
influence,
impact.
do we develop the pork culture so that we have the bacon and sausage and stuff that we eat today? So I mean, even if it all shakes out, what if it's just the U.S. as it is now, but we don't have dogs and pork?
I mean, that could be a significant, and some of that's cultural stuff that could totally exist outside of the religion.
Well,
Concepts
yeah.
of just kind
Well, I
of.
mean, concepts of roles
Yeah.
in women, the concept of the power of church and religion, and how religion relates to government, and I mean, there's a lot of different stuff. I mean, there are differences, and there's a lot of similarities between Islam and Christianity in that too. But the way they developed over time, it means things, and so I mean, even just by changing sort of the cultural norms, even if in the end, kind of the balance of power works out the same, then it still could dramatically change. I mean, art, architecture, that sort of thing, but also things that we do culturally today that are still derived from, norms that we're still developing at the time.
Yeah, I think that what happens in Western civilization during the following centuries, if through the 800s and the 900s, what if the feudal system does not develop in the way that it actually did? And there's at least in some of my research that seems to indicate that the Franks basically are kind of the primogenitors of the feudal system, and that Charles Martel specifically, he basically manages to strip some property from the church and use it to reward his followers. So basically, he is demonstrating the Lord and rewarding his vassals at the expense of the church that he is also saving.
Yeah, no, that was a significant piece of his victory here, was his ability to do that, because that not only gave him the leverage to take that land from the church, but that also is how he was able to kind of consolidate his power.
Mm-hmm. So we never get a feudal Europe, though we get something closer to what the Umayyads are doing.
That's an interesting, because certainly the Franks, that was a big, how it developed had a lot to do with how the Franks, how they existed, and that's interesting, because I mean, gosh, that spreads pretty much all over Europe for the next almost 1,000 years.
I mean, we're talking about how important this area is, but I mean, actually, the Carolingians are very, very important to how Europe develops culturally. Yeah. And if you see, I mean, even if this just means that someone else wins the fight among the Franks, then it could end up being a fairly different culturally, fairly different Europe.
Mm. Yeah, I'll go out on a limb and propose that in at least one counterfactual situation, if Martel does not win at Tours, I do believe that he has a chance to redeem himself, as he ultimately does in 734, 735, and then in 739, where he finally basically ends the ambitions of the Umayyads in southern France.
Yeah, I mean, you can't say that this was the only battle that could be. But you can in terms of a counterfactual here, it could be Martel that dies instead of Al-Rahman, which could shift things. But also, again, Martel was still trying to bring the Franks together. And if he loses here, that would seem to have lost a lot of his ability to do that. But yeah, I mean, when we get to the idea that this was just this one battle and that was everything was decided here, is not a fair decision. And you're right. There's a good chance that had they lost at Tours, depending on the nature of that loss, and how powerful they still were, whether he survives and all that sort of thing, then that they would have had other chances to fight the Umayyads and.
Well, I don't think it would have ended his chances of consolidating his power, but certainly his victory at Tours gave him a lot of leverage and ability to consolidate it in the way that he did, and quickly.
It also meant that Aquitaine was able to regain independence too. So because that was a big part of his consolidation. Yeah. So even if just Aquitaine stays in the hands of the Umayyads, that impacts him fairly significantly. And what if the Umayyads, if they win a victory here, decide they're going to follow up relatively quickly? Then is he able to consolidate the Franks at the same time that he's trying to fight off more persistent attacks from the Umayyads?
Yeah.
I think that to an extent we have an indication that he probably would have been able to, because he's fighting the Frisians when the Umayyads attack again, and again in 734, 735, and then 739. And he actually has to go to the Lombards for help. And I get the impression that the Lombards and the French, much as the French and the Germans, are not traditional allies when it comes to matters of state.
Yeah. And that's an interesting the relationship between those two. And yet there was at least some reason to stand against the Umayyads, who were I think at worst they were at worst they were going to destroy all Christendom, but at best they were still a foreign power trying to come in and
seem much more foreign.
Yeah.
But I mean, that goes back to, too, you don't have to shift very much before you get very different borders. Like the whole concept of what is Italy could easily have, because that concept only really develops in the 19th century, right? So I mean, just weakening the Carolinians could mean that you get a very different, that, people don't see Italy as Italy. They see Italy as Lombardy and papal states.
Yeah, that idea is extremely recent, and it's amazing to think about what kind of pieces of that could so dramatically change it, because of course there are the mountains between France and Spain, and that certainly had an impact on where that border ended up, but there were lots of borders that crossed those mountains in before that, and it easily could have. I mean, Aquitaine was not necessarily culturally French in any sense until much later.
The concept of what culturally France meant, even because I don't think there was even a vision of France, right?
No, the whole idea of nation states, which we see a lot of people. Well, they'll go back and be like, "Oh, this is the history of my country," and it's interesting to see that, because those I don't know that someone from Frankia that the Franks would understand what modern France, like, I don't know that they would see the relationships there. They wouldn't understand quite what made France. They were just on such very different ideas of states.
I think that it's a good example of something that is a crucial difference between the 21st century, the 20th century, the 19th century, and the early medieval period, and that is the concept of the nation state is foreign. The closest thing I think you would have that you might have gotten was a certain allegiance to, say, the Roman Empire, some of the very long-lived dynasties in China. But ultimately, when we look at almost every conflict from the fall of Rome up until the 18th century, those usually take place along tribal or regional fractures. So being a Lombard is far more important than saying, "Oh no, I'm Northern Italian. I'm a Saxon," versus versus I'm a member of a nation state that isn't going to be formed until until the late 1870s, called Germany. France. I don't think. I don't think that the average person, if you had asked them at the time contemporaneously and said, "Oh, well, what do you think of this wonderful, France?" They would say, "Huh? Yeah. No, I'm Andalusian.
We draw a lot of lines on these old medieval maps, and in some ways, it's maybe not best understood with those lines. Those lines are kind of something we impose upon them. I think we're still seeing that. I mean, I think that's part of the reason why in a lot of parts of the world where there's so much destabilization and instability is that we still have groups of people who, we've drawn all these lines around them, and I don't know if they see the world that way. That's just not...
The Basque separatists.
Yeah.
Again, there's an example of, yes, they are definitely in lines with... They're within the lines of the map that have been drawn for quite some time. But they still have the argument that, no, we are culturally and ethnically different.
Yeah.
We are not Spanish. We are Basque.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly how things change if you have Aquitaine decide that they're not ethnically.
If they never see themselves as part of France.
it's hard for a modern audience to kind of see that and understand that, because I think our national allegiance is usually so important, especially
when we have such
an
an idea of this is France, this is Spain, this is Portugal.
Yeah. That all formed over a very long period,
Martel
and I think we
loses
would love
there,
to
and
be
Andorra.
able to.
What happens to Andorra?
Yeah, right. That's
How is that?
those
San Marino.
those matter.
What about San Marino? Does that still survive? Liechtenstein. Don't forget Liechtenstein.
Don't forget Liechtenstein or Luxembourg, which is also
yes.
right there.
Well, I mean, well into the 20th century, Alsace and Lorraine could simply not decide whether they were
Yes.
German or French, and that, But I mean, but the whole idea even of a nation state, the idea that you even have borders, isn't even solidified at this point, and so
And extremely solid borders, because I think in a lot of ways, I mean, the power of any monarch at this period is going to kind of in a gradient change, and it's not going to be an even gradient of power closer to the source. I mean, just depending on who's in power in this place and what tribe is running that, and sometimes the connection was merely that they paid tribute, but that didn't necessarily mean you had anything.
And that gets weaker every spot that you go. So this idea that we draw a line, that we recognize the line, that we put a little box there on the road, you got
and that everyone on one side of it is
through that. I mean, that whole thing. I mean, that whole concept might not have developed in the same way.
Yeah, and that's I don't know that nation states was the necessary inevitable evolution. I honestly don't know, but even if it is, how we define those nation states certainly.
I mean, that's not really how the caliphate was ruled. And
No,
so
not
yeah,
really.
how do you define them? Though I mean, in a broader sense, we can still say too. I mean, if there was if this was one of the far end where it results in a huge Muslim conquest that goes well into Germany and northern Italy and all that stuff that we call German and Italy and Europe today. That might mean they're just not as fractious. It might mean that you have a unity of purpose and a unity of culture that could provide years and years of peace and development and a whole different sort of idea
That's
of
fair.
Europe than we see today. So I mean, there's something to be said for
I
the
mean-
idea that what if we were to try to bring them all together? Though I honestly think the lesson is when you try to do that, the more you try to hold on to, the more you try to hold on to star systems, the more they slip through your fingers. I should have recognized your foul stench when I came on board.
Yeah, there's definitely, and back to one of our standard arguments. It's empires, they typically don't last for long. There are the exceptions to the rule. But the Umayyads, obviously, the fact that they're only an additional 10
I mean, the
years
bottom line is if
after
they were
Tours,
out of steam, does one victory make a difference? No matter how big a victory.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know that victory
Yeah.
in France was going to be able to solve or even delay what was going on elsewhere in that empire. I mean, that's I did see some arguments that maybe like the defeat at Tours contributed in some way to the revolt among the Berbers, but it's ultimately, the problem with the Berbers was that they were being taxed too hard. And the Caliphate, the Umayyads, are doing that because they're trying to hold their whole empire together, and they need money to do that. And
If you just Google why did the Umayyad Caliphate collapse, one of the things that's always on that list is that they overextended. And so you're talking about, let's go take France and Germany and Italy. And I mean, they were already like a long way away from. They were in Damascus at the time, right? They hadn't moved to Baghdad, so you were already a long way from Damascus at the time that you were fighting Tours.
Yeah, and where the Emirs are successful is largely with peoples who they're able to conquer, and then they're able to enlist to the cause. And I'm not sure that you're going to be able to, say, get the Frisians, the Saxons, the Lombards, or some of the areas that still have the tradition of the Roman Empire to buy into the religio-political vision.
It's true, but
that
you
is,
probably
the
wouldn't have said that
caliphate.
about the Visigoths either. I mean, it would have been easy to say like, there's no way that Islam would always would take Spain,
to some extent, they struggled
That is a good point.
in Spain. Maybe they struggled in Spain more than they struggled elsewhere. But I mean, the reason Spain becomes a Christianized after that is because there was just they worked very hard at getting rid of all the Muslims in Spain.
Once the Reconquista began, But and
Yeah.
essentially the fall in Spain is very much like when we talked about the Incas a few weeks ago. I mean, if they had not been in civil war themselves, if the Visigoths had been more unified and not fighting amongst themselves, then it would have been very difficult to come across.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you could back up,
they fall apart,
just a couple hundred years, just a couple centuries or whatever from tours, you can also ask the question: what happens if they never make it across the strait? What happens if Islam is still stuck in Africa, and the Visigoths remain powerful in Spain? And does that essentially keep some version of the Roman Empire going there in Western Europe for a very long time?
Yeah, and there we have to ask ourselves, who is Count Julian of, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation on this, of Cueta or Sueta, who apparently was the count who invited the Umayyads into their conflict.
Yeah, we have an episode on this. Maybe we can do another one of these episodes when we get there. Yeah.
And when it comes to conquering, I mean, one of the things we talked about how these civil wars had allowed both these powers to gain. It's interesting that the Franks were in the middle of a civil war, but they were able to avoid the same pitfalls. And that has a lot to do with his victory here, I think.
Being the hammer of the Moors, I mean, had a lot to do with his ability to consolidate the empire that he did.
And that allows him to put himself into that great man position. Yeah. And is there someone who's going to come in and fulfill that vacuum? If it's not Charles Martel, I think you can make a good argument. Probably not. It's certainly not going to be Odo, because Odo only has 3 years to live.
Yeah.
And I don't think I can't think of any contenders at the moment who are contemporaneous who might have been able to pull that sort of.
And you would have to look down that 3 generations too, because really it's Charlemagne that changes things, and Martel really starts the path to Charlemagne. So is there someone else there that would be able to not only consolidate, but then to be able to maintain and grow in the way? I mean, so at very least the defeat at Tours might have meant, a great delay in the Reconquista. It might mean that Spain remains Muslim for much, much longer, because Tours is kind of Tours the start of when they start to build the force to come and take it.
Maybe the Merovingian dynasty is able to have a run of good leaders, where the do-nothing kings suddenly become eclipsed by, the person who takes this sort of these sort of accomplishments that Martel was not able to because of a hypothetical death or not success. So maybe there's a renaissance of the Merovingian dynasty.
Yeah, there still was, because there was still a king there. I'm not sure who it was, what his name was, but
Is it Childeric?
That could be that sounds right to me, because that, of course, but right before.
And at that point, Martel is still technically working on behalf of the Merovingian Empire.
Yes.
Our Merovingian dynasty, not empire per se.
Because he's still mayor of the palace.
Yeah.
We haven't brought up what happens if Bigfoot is involved.
Oh,
which is, I don't know which side Bigfoot would have chosen, but it feels like he could have changed things. It seems like this is a place where one Bigfoot.
Well, in the middle of the battle, if he came walking out of the trees there, that might have just distracted everybody. Because remember, they were using the forest.
Maybe it just ends
flank.
the fight. What?
So I mean, if Bigfoot ruled the forest, I mean, I'm trying to see. I mean, is there some version of Bigfoot in Europe?
Well, we can infer from the fact that Bigfoot is a mountain-dwelling creature that he would have been in the period.
That might be a
Therefore, his role in this hypothetical situation would have been that he scares Abd al-Rahim's horse, causing him to die before his army even gets into France. Because, as we all know, horses do not like Bigfoot.
The European equivalent of Sasquatch is often called the wild men of the woods or wild people. So, see, it could have at any moment, wild men of the woods, because woods were involved in the battle, right? So
yes, multiple, and I mean, maybe there was more than one.
What if one side or the other actually allies with the wild?
Yeah, and who's more? And which side is more likely?
How does Europe change if the fight between the Franks and the Umayyads, destabilizes them enough that the European Sasquatches are able to form their own empire? We have Sasquatchia.
Then we have a nation state of Sasquatches today. That's the Sasquatchia. I feel like they'd be a little isolationist even today.
Oh, hey, here's something, though, is that the Umayyads were fairly famous for intolerance of homosexuality. Like Umayyad caliphs would have, many of them had, male relationships. And so that could be a very different, that could be a cultural impact on Europe if there's a greater, Umayyad impact on culture in Europe.
There is an interesting question there, and that is that an actual fact, or was that part of the propaganda that was put together by the Abbasids to discredit the Umayyads? Because part of the Abbasid movement was they wanted to return to a more pure and less
I don't know.
Decadent Islam. And as we've seen throughout, the famous example of the Byzantine empress who just absolute scurrilous accusations, Theodora, I believe, the propaganda sometimes becomes history, even though it's definitely not true. Catherine the Great, another victim of horrible, scurrilous rumors or propaganda.
The interesting thing about that Catherine the Great is that was a period, actually, rumor. That was actually started in the period to sully her name. It's not like something that came 100 years later, and people still bring that up.
Yeah, that stuff can really, really stay in the public mindset. Incredible to think that, stuff that was meant to discredit them and hundreds of years ago is still discrediting them today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And quite honestly, that's one of the reasons that I love to study history, is these interesting, stories, these interesting turns of event.
Absolutely. And this one, I mean, tour really is as one where there's a potential where you're talking about a dramatic change. And I mean, just literally who we are, how we think of ourselves.
Yeah.
I mean, when you take a 23andMe, that you'd have the same colors, but they would all think of themselves differently. And how much that changes. Even
if it wasn't that important of a battle, really, had a huge impact on kind of our conception of, our conception of all of Europe, and certainly how Europe saw itself for, up to the modern era. But certainly, the Middle Ages was all defined and had a lot to do with this battle impact.
Kind of a minimum impact of Martel losing at Tours would be that Aquitaine stays with the Umayyads, and that means that a very possible impact of it is that the whole idea of where the line between France and Spain is 200 miles farther north. Yeah. I mean, really, a huge chunk of what we see to be France would have been a chunk of Spain.
Yes, enormous implications.
Yeah, and just how everybody identifies and sees each other. But I mean, think about what that would mean in the 20th century world wars. Yeah, I mean, would France be the player that it is if it was half the size or 2/3 the size?
Yeah, or what if the Reconquista just starts in Burgundy and just takes that much longer going south?
True. I mean, you can make a fair argument in terms of, and this is the argument with Make the Great Man. You can make a fair argument that the Reconquista was really inevitable, that Islam had moved beyond where it culturally could truly survive, that the people in Spain even were still, at their heart, not Muslim, whether they were clearly Christian.
Yeah.
And how or when this moves it, that in the end, the Umayyads, when they collapsed, and you leave nothing but a little rump state, because essentially the Al-Andalusia becomes a rump state of the Umayyads, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was not going to survive in the long run. And so you could also, kind of make that this battle's just not all that important, because the larger events it seems to affect were events that were really, pretty much inevitable. I mean, that you get some version of Charlemagne, you get some version of Reconquista, you get some version of, Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire or whatever, just because the Umayyads had already gone too far at that point to truly maintain.
That might be the constant question of whether the great man theory is. We see these people who are important because they were important, to what happened, but maybe those events were drawing them along more than.
Yeah, and there's there's some strength behind that to argue that events are bigger than people, and you can see that here. You can see the potential when you're really talking about the argument of how far would Islam have gone versus Christianity. Maybe to Gibraltar was the limit. They weren't going to cross in terms of a permanent sort of thing. That the crossing to Europe was always going to be temporary because it was always simply beyond the reach of a caliphate that was going to be based in the Middle East, and whose heart and philosophy was there.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow the History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.